My friends, good day. Since Brexit, the United Kingdom, as you have all clearly noticed, has become a laboratory. Wherever there is a dubious idea, whether it comes from the World Economic Forum Bilderberg or elsewhere, it is implemented first in the United Kingdom. Then, if it shows that it works, in other words, if it causes disasters, if it causes damage. Let's imagine that it will generate inflation, capital flight, it will generate unemployment, it will generate misery, business closures, all of that. At that point, it's validated, considered brilliant, and that's how it ends up coming to France. So in reality, we have three countries that are collapsing in Europe. We have the United Kingdom, which is literally becoming a third world country. Quite simply. Statistics show that soon, by 2030, so in the coming years, Poland will far surpass the British economy. We also have the British by 2031, so we're talking about a time frame of about 5 or 6 years, who will be poorer than the Turks and Lithuania. Just to give you a sense of scale, which is still quite shocking. So the country has taken a vow of poverty, but not its people. The people were never consulted. They were never asked the question. There should have been a referendum, and people should have been told they're being impoverished for generations. The only thing that will be lasting in Europe is widespread impoverishment. Because Europe, as I've often said in the videos, you have to understand that Europe naturally is a continent that is not rich. Europe is naturally poor. There are no energy resources in Europe. There are no raw materials. That's the reality. That's the only real thing. You can't build an economy by everyone just sitting in a Zoom meeting. We start talking to each other and call it the economy. Zoom works. We need meetings. We need a lot of things. We need consulting. We need those things. But that can never replace the real economy. The real economy needs energy. Energy is literally about to be banned in Europe. So obviously the result we're seeing, we have Germany. I was talking about energy. Germany is collapsing. Volkswagen, the manufacturer, is facing huge liquidity crises. It is believed that he will probably, maybe to save himself, he might break up the group or split it into several entities and then try to see which ones can survive. But I can tell you that just in the automotive sector, with many jobs in Europe, I can tell you that there are plenty of companies we know today that won't exist in the coming years. Why? Because they are turning into toxic assets. What is a toxic asset? It's when you have, for example, let's say shares of a company. Let's say this company, for example, is a pharmaceutical lab. One day, the regulatory authority withdrew the license for its flagship drug. So what's going to happen? We have government intervention in this company's commercial operations. Its product is banned, so it's stuck in pharmacies. We can't buy it anymore, and the order book goes straight to zero. And at that point, it's a collapse. Well, the assets of European car manufacturers are toxic assets. Why? Because their flagship product, which is the automobile, let me remind you that it was invented in Europe. Well, it's now at a stage where it's about to be banned in Europe. They'll have to compete with electric vehicles, but the Chinese have already mastered them, which gives us this feeling that Europe has forbidden itself from building vehicles, cars, in order to make room for China. Some might say it's only fair. That's what we call climate justice. Climate justice means going after countries that are considered responsible for climate change. Everyone interprets it in their own way. There are people who say last year it was colder than this year, or last year it was the opposite, or this year it's raining more than usual or less than usual. It doesn't matter any variation that anyone subjectively considers undesirable. This one is about responsibility of Europe. And then, of course, it will automatically trigger rights to reparations, rights to transfers of wealth, transfers of jobs, transfers of know-how, financial flows, and all that. So, by the way, in the last video, when I talked about Nexperia, at one point, I misspoke. And of course, the story of Nexperia with its chips takes place in the Netherlands. And at one point, I don't know why, I said Denmark. I've visited both countries many times. I assure you, even when I visited them, I often confused one for the other. I'm not sure why. Nexperia, as I told you, the company was split in two now. Because the part that's in the Netherlands, you see, I'm being careful. The part that's in the Netherlands was seized by the Dutch authorities. But the Chinese part, which in fact is the one that produces, is the one that manufactures the semiconductors and the chips and all that. Well, that part was taken by China in response. What happens then? It'll be a mess for whom? It'll fall back on the Germans, right? Won't this impact European car manufacturers that rely on Nexperia's products? But China says, fine, okay, you're seizing by force the company we bought. You're going to nationalize it or do whatever you want. Except the production is in our country and we're not selling you the chips. Honestly, that's just stupid. That means this was done at the request of the American administration. And you realize that since 1945, Europe has had absolutely no sovereignty. It's not even about sovereignty, absolutely no dignity. It's literally they obey orders from elsewhere to the letter, orders that aren't even their own, which are not in their interest, nor in the interest of their people or their growth or their economy or their jobs or anything else. No, they are capable on a simple order with just a snap of the fingers of taking positions that go against their own interests. So, by the way, you realize something, you saw where the value really is. Look, think carefully about this one. You have a company that's headquartered in the Netherlands and has its manufacturing units in China. So there is this dispute, this economic war between China, the United States, the Netherlands, all of that. The Netherlands takes possession of the part that's in the Netherlands. And what's in there? Well, there's Julie with her big glasses, her blue streak of hair, and her badge. She works in human resources. There are people in meetings all day, the secretary, the potted plant, everything. But who makes the chips? Well, it's the worker in China. You see, that means that when it was sent, the Chinese said, well, you know what, Julie, with her big glasses, just ignore her. Don't worry, you'll get paid. And then we keep on producing, but the Netherlands can't just say, well, we'll produce. The Chinese aren't talking to us anymore. Here are our emails. When we send them, they bounce back at us. So, well, we'll produce the chips here. You see what I mean? That's when you realize what matters and what doesn't. Then you see that Europe, well, it's just putting on a show of economics. It's running an artificial economy while it's the economy that actually makes things. The real economy, the economy of energy, of raw materials, all of that is happening somewhere else. That's the problem. Is it? I'd like to tell you something. Going back to the beginning of the video, a lot of bad experiments were tested on the British people. Who is suffering right now? Nasty, nasty. They're being imported into France. For example, the idea of taxing large fortunes, not even taxing their income, but taxing their wealth itself, really. Claiming you own so much and threatening to take more, plus aggressive talk like, we'll stop them at the airport, and similar remarks. The issue is, this was tested in the United Kingdom. What was the result? Well, it led to, for example, the founder of Revolut, the neobank Revolut, 200 billion, I think, his fortune, $200 billion. Well, he went to live in the Emirates. You see, we have people who went to live in Italy, in Monaco, all that. They leave. We're not in 1750 where you just have to send Zookman after them. We'll tax them and they'll just pay quietly. No, that's not how it works now. I'm not defending billionaires or the rich, but there's something, I'm against it, that these sprawling states that are wasting money are taking more money, whether it's from minimum wage earners, retirees, or billionaires. By the way, speaking of the United Kingdom, that's how it started. It wants to come to you. That's how we started. We should tax billionaires. A speech like that is always popular. Yes, they need to pay and all that. The top 1% of the richest people pay 30% of all taxes. But still, what happened is that we started by taxing the billionaire. And now we are in the process of. There are plenty of retirees who live on miserable pensions who are receiving the tax bill for the first time. See what I mean? It always starts with something and continues. We always start with extreme cases, and in the end, we expand, expand, expand. He's a billionaire, so don't worry. He has tax advisors. Some even have family offices. They have offices where people manage their fortunes. And that's not something new from Zuckman, it's been around for a long time. Their fortune is well invested and spread globally, not just sitting in a safe. So someone comes and says, give us 2% or 3%, it doesn't matter, just ignore him. He protected himself long ago. You see what I mean? But when we can't get to him, we'll just go after the retiree, plain and simple. We'll target the minimum wage earner, the student, and the person who downloads a song or movie just to watch it. We're saying, give us a right, aren't we? After a while, today what's happening is that this taxation is turning into a straitjacket. It's turning into something else. It's not even a tax anymore at this point. At this point, it's more like a tribute. Why? Because you have a sprawling state that takes the fruit of your labor by force. It gives it out as it pleases, sometimes to friends, sometimes overseas, all without consulting you, giving you any say, or letting you choose to leave the system. I don't want that. You can't say that. You can't do that. Okay? So we have a state that is acting like a colonial entity, engaging in plundering and dispossession for its own interests. So you know me, you know my inclinations. The state, for me, is nothing more than a committee that manages the affairs of the ruling classes. So now it's not managing your business or mine, it's managing the business of certain people, of certain groups. By the way, tell me the last time the state made a decision that was in your favor. You see, it doesn't happen. We always say we must respect the law, but what really is the law? The law is written and it's made by the ruling classes. Look, there's a woman, her apartment was squatted. Well, the squatters weren't there. She hired a bailiff. She went back to her home. So she broke the lock they had installed. She put in a new lock and she went back to her home. Well, today she was arrested by the police and taken into custody. And all this because of breaking and entering, because the squatter filed a complaint against her. Because you were the one who asked for this law. Find someone, go out in France, your building or your street, just one person. Name one person who supported this law. Show me anyone who thinks it's normal. You see, the law is not the expression of the people's will. The law is not the expression of what you want. The law is not the expression of what the citizens, in their majority or as a whole, want. It's not even the expression of the majority. It's not even the expression of a minority. The law is the expression of a dominant caste that imposes the law on you. That's why there's discourse about respecting the law as sacred, because that's their main point. They want you to obey their orders, to obey their whims, their sensitivities. Of course, agreed? Today, it was decided, I think that's pretty clear. There are 3 countries that are, as I said, bankrupt. Germany, once called Europe's locomotive, isn't leading anymore. It's now on a sidetrack. It's smoking everywhere, with half of its companies now being toxic assets. So that's Germany. Then we have the United Kingdom, which is becoming, well, the laughingstock of the world. And then we have France as well. Macron's France, which is in this group of 3. By the way, they're called the Club of Volunteers, right? And they want, coincidentally, they want to start a war because it allows them to divert attention from their record. Then I don't know what's going on in their heads. It's not even about diverting attention from their record, because a war will just add to their record. I think that rather a war will allow them to bring about the destruction they're already causing without the war. It will allow them to bring about this destruction more quickly. Obviously, you see, if you want to destroy a country like France, well, at first, you act like what Macron is doing right now. You destroy. The problem is it's slow and takes time, but involving it in a war speeds things up. Obviously, that's it. That's all. War is just a catalyst. It's just a catalyst. Of course, even without war, they will achieve their goal if they are left in power, if they are not touched and left in power. Obviously, you see, obviously in the end, they will cause the same damage that a war would have caused. But the advantage of a war from their perspective is that this will be achieved much more quickly. I also saw in all this, I feel like this video is going all over the place, but it's not actually going all over the place. There is a line, a guiding thread. I saw an elected official from the Socialist Party saying that inheritance should be abolished and that inheritance was described as something that just falls from the sky. Okay, so people work their whole lives, right? And they can't leave their property to their children. Because this property fell from the sky, and what falls from the sky, of course, goes into the state's coffers. That way, it can be spent on shoes, taxi fares, food expenses. It can be handed out here and there. In the United Kingdom, we acquire Starmer, who went to Pakistan while the country is borrowing money. 30 years after a 5.5%, we're slowly heading towards 6%. I can tell you that a number of years ago, I saw consumer loans for vehicles that were around 6%. Today, the British government is making consumer loans that are spread out, but here we're talking about billions and billions. For what? Spending freely with generosity. So I was saying that the British Prime Minister gave Pakistan 110 million pounds sterling. We're talking about 130, 140 million euros to buy condoms for the Pakistanis for family planning in Pakistan. I understand that he wants to fight against immigration, but he's starting a bit early. On the assembly line, it's complete madness. Before the government keeps taxing these countries to death. Until they take the entire economy from everyone's possessions, whether they're rich or poor or not. They take everything, waste it, burn it, and give it away abroad. We really need to ask questions about government spending. But that's a taboo subject. It's a question that never gets asked. The government has a frantic pace of life, and to finance it, it sends out the authorities. It has discovered this taste. It's an addiction like that. It has an addiction to other people's money. I can take, they're my slaves. Speaking of slaves, let me tell you something. In Algeria, up until my grandmother's generation, when we talked about someone who worked in bad conditions, worked in the fields, all that for someone else. He was working a field that wasn't his own. Do you know what we called him? The kamis, the one who works for a fifth. Do you know where that comes from? That comes from feudalism. In feudalism, the lords own all the land. Similar to Bill Gates, they own everything. You own nothing. And what if you want to work? But they can't work all the land. I mean, they have too much. They can't be everywhere at once. They have castles and all that with more rooms than they could ever visit in their lifetime. So what you do is like, you go to the Lord and you tell him that land you have lying fallow, you have 2 hectares over there, or I don't know. I'll work on it. You let me work on it. I'll plant potatoes or strawberries or whatever. I'll give you a fifth of the harvest. Feudalism. In feudalism, I'm telling you, because it was the same in Europe. Feudalism was the defining story of the 5th for centuries. The worker who worked the land kept 80%. I didn't notice. Income. Subtitles. Father, do you see? It means that even the feudal lords consider taxing more than 20% was slavery, you see? Well, today we have effective tax rates in some countries through various layers that are getting close to 100%. And we actually have people, voices from the Socialist Party, for example, who say that we must. How shall I say, do we abolish inheritance? If we abolish inheritance, are we also ending private property? Why? Because you work your whole life, and when you die, the property goes to the state. That actually means you were a tenant of your property. You never owned it. You were always a tenant. And you imagine that we'll have to fundamentally change the structure of society to do that. Just so they can spend on food expenses, just so they can spend on taxis and shoes. I mean, those people, those who live off others, I assure you, those who live off others, if there isn't a full-scale revolution, I assure you, they'll bring Europe back to worse than the Middle Ages. Really, People for generations won't understand why they have to go into the forest to look for snails to eat or wash themselves in the river or something like that. Even though they have pictures showing that their grandparents still lived in a certain comfort, they won't understand that they let themselves be overtaken by this. By the way, speaking of which, in the video, the socialist representative, whose name I don't have, I've forgotten it, he was saying that. If I remember it, I'll let you know. Well, he was saying that taking 100% of the inheritance means there's no inheritance left. Everything is taken at the person's death, the state, the crumbs, because you have to know one thing. At your death, what you own is just crumbs from what the state has deigned to let you keep. The state, after taking from you at your boss's office, then takes taxes from you, then television fees, then deductions, then fines, then all sorts of things. Well, once it gets to the point where they maybe leave you with 10% of the actual product of your work, well, when you die, they take the rest. Why? To finance the ecological transition? Okay, ecological transition, scamology. That's what we call scamology. So what he wants to do is finance what he calls the transition. In fact, the ecological transition is what we're seeing in Europe. It's Europe turning back into wasteland and allowing other countries to develop. Since justice, I'm not the only one saying this. Do you even look at Greenpeace's tweets and all that? Climate justice is gender justice, it's racial justice, it's all kinds of justice. They see all struggles as connected, a woke struggle. They put them under the climate, and climate means that Europe, France, it's over, all of that, it's finished. It has to become a wasteland again. And then people, well, they'll just eat grass porridge or something. There you go. It's pretty terrible what's happening right now. Honestly, I'd really like to say something positive. I'm trying, you know? I'm aware that I'm not saying positive things, but unfortunately, I'm just stating the facts. Yeah, I wish I had been wrong. I wish I could say, well, there you go. I messed up. Everything is going well. We're booming. In 2026, recovery will arrive, companies will hire, inflation will drop, and peace will return. I would really like that. Honestly, I would really like that. I assure you, I had to cut my losses and take my family off this continent of lunatics. It's that there are elites who are there corrupting the countries, and there is an obedient and docile population. It's an explosive cocktail. You can't do worse. Well, anyway, thank you. Worse, there's the atomic bomb, anyway. Thank you, my friends, for listening to this video up to this point. Sus, let's try to meet next time. See you soon, Sus.